Alrighty. Do some more Civil War this week. So we left off First Battle Bull Run. We almost got the coolest thing, ironclads. Okay, these things are awesome. So these are big, bulky metal floating fortresses of sorts that are created in the Civil War. And so they're metal lined ships, very heavy. You can see sort of even this one in the picture here. It's like real deep in the water. That's because these things weigh a lot. They have huge armor plating on them. And it's one of the few examples of ships in warfare, or a technology in warfare, where like the defensive has progressed faster than the offensive. Because usually you have like bullets and bombs, things that can blow up anything, right? In this case, though, you've got a ship that's armor has like outscaled its weaponry, and so as a result, they're like nearly unsinkable. Ironclads have to be either hitting like a weak area where the metal is already damaged, or running into like rocks and things underwater to be taken down, because otherwise the cannons just sort of bounce off these things, right? And as a result, these are created to break blockades. These, the North has a larger navy. They're using it to sort of stranglehold or starve out the southern states by blocking them from getting food and supplies in. These things can run blockades by just driving right through them. They can't sink them. They can just sail on away. And they're very at the very beginning, they're super successful. The Union's sort of response is to make their own ironclads, and what you get are these weird stalemate battles where these big iron ships are just firing at each other till they like run out of ammunition, or one just like sails away. It's a real weird sort of thing, but they are sort of in a way like the first battleships, like metal battleships. Just the weapons aren't quite there yet. So it led to some really interesting naval battles. And General Winfield, I believe his first name, Winfield Scott, was one who came up with this idea of, you can see the picture, of blockading the South. Scott's Great Snake, this idea of like starve them out of resources, and eventually you can win the war without ever even having to fight. And it kind of was centered around maintaining a blockade, but also taking over the Mississippi River. This river is sort of a key lifeline to a lot of the southern states, and he thought that was an area where taking and seizing control there could really be a major turning point for the North, a way to put pressure on the South in sort of a really fast-moving way, right? And that's where, at the very beginnings of this, we start to see Ulysses S. Grant. Why is that too low? That's weird. Okay, well, it says defeat down there. He's in charge of taking the Mississippi River. And the Battle of Shiloh is sort of one of the first places that he sort of makes a pretty big impression. He is not big on conditional surrender. Ulysses S. Grant is big on unconditional surrender. This idea that you don't get to name terms when you surrender. You don't get to say we surrender if you let us go and don't arrest us, blah, blah, blah. He's more along the lines of like, if you surrender, it's up to me what happens to you. It doesn't matter what you want, right? It's unconditional. There are no conditions to it. That's what he wants. And the Battle of Shiloh at first didn't look real good. I mean, he was losing this battle pretty handedly. They're fighting along these sort of heavily forested areas, and supposedly he gives a real rousing speech to his soldiers to get them to fight harder, and ends up snatching a victory from what looked like the jaws of defeat, right? And he's starting to make a name for himself. He's not yet the commander of the entire Union Army yet, though. Right? So we're going to come back to Grant later after he has a little bit more success in this sort of Western campaign. But this is sort of his beginnings, right? Looking back east, you've got Robert E. Lee for the South that is now put in complete command of the Confederate Army. And he kind of changes his approach a little bit. So there was a big push for, getting foreign aid, right? The South really wanted to have, other countries in Europe help fund and support their war, but they hadn't gotten enough convincing victories, right? And so these countries were, too hesitant to get involved. They didn't want to back a country they thought was going to lose the Civil War. And so Robert E. Lee's decision to go on the offensive was a big one, because he said, hey, if we go and invade some of these northern states and win there, it's kind of a twofold thing. One, victories in the offensive would prove that they're doing very successful in this war, and it might lead to increased support from foreign countries. Or two, by winning in the north, it kind of puts the north in a state of, there's some real stakes now. We can lose some territory as a result of this. It makes it sort of scarier. So he's preparing for that, sort of situation to take place. He's getting his armies ready for it. And as they sort of begin to march more northward, we go back to the Battle of Bull Run for what's called the Second Battle of Bull Run. Very original name. Where Lee's forces kind of recklessly rush into the Union Army. And the casualties of this battle are pretty massive. Second Battle of Bull Run, there's a lot of death and wounded on both sides. The Union Army's forced to retreat, and this is where he's going to take the opportunity to go on the offensive. Okay, and that's the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam is kind of a really embarrassing battle in a way. So for as good of a strategist as Lee is, this speaks more to the poor strategy of Union commanders, I guess, because his strategy, the plan that Robert E. Lee had, got leaked. The North, the Union, got access to information about where Lee's armies were going to be, where they were hoping to invade at, and had enough time to set a trap or plan to fight there. The Northern commanders were so bad that they had all that information and still didn't win this battle. Think about that. They knew where Lee's armies were going to be. They knew how many soldiers he had. They knew when he was planning on being there. And they still were unable to win the battle. Antietam kind of ends with no victory on either side. Massive casualties on both. So huge amounts of death and wounded. I guess it's impressive that Lee didn't straight out lose this battle. But I would argue it's more impressive that the North messed it up so badly. Right? Was not the decisive victory he was hoping to get, to sort of get support from foreign countries, and if anything, starting to show the northern states that, hey, this is going to take a lot longer than they had expected. Right. So the end of the first years of the Civil War, the North is learning it's not going to be an easy victory. Right. In a way, Lee going on the offensive had helped Lincoln, because now it sort of creates more patriotism. More people are willing to get involved in this war because, look, it's no longer the South that's trying to defend themselves. They're now invading. So it kind of backfired in a little way there, in terms of support from the North, and ends up with, foreign countries still not willing to get involved. So they didn't get exactly what they wanted, right? And going into, what they're doing after this, you have to talk about this idea of emancipation, right? Lincoln talking about emancipation is sort of a really complicated issue. There's a lot of different reasons as to why this is happening. First of all, emancipation means to free or end slavery, right? There is a lot to be gained from the North by promoting that idea of ending slavery, right? Obviously, there are a lot of people who supported Lincoln and the Republican Party at the time period who were not big fans of slavery, right? That was, in fact, one of the big platforms that a lot of people ran on the Free Soil Party, was that that was a party that existed exclusively to end slavery, support of abolitionists, right? And so when it came to why would Lincoln support the idea of emancipation, there's huge military benefits to freeing slaves, to turning slaves against the South. It makes the United States look more sympathetic to these European countries that have mostly all ended slavery. So we're kind of looking a little weird being one of the only more developed countries that still practice it. And also he's getting pressure from, part of his voter base, abolitionists, saying, hey, what are you going to do with the slavery issue? Because even though he didn't say he wanted to touch slavery in existing states when he became president, these states still left the Union, and, look what happened in the middle of a civil war. So he creates what's called the Emancipation Proclamation. It is a weird document in a way, because it's part bluff, part actual strategy. He basically gives a date to the southern states. He says if you don't rejoin the Union by, I believe, January 1st, 1863, you will, when you lose the war, or if you surrender later, all slaves in your states are free. End slavery in any state that does not rejoin the Union. So in theory, you could have rejoined the Union and kept your slaves, right? And remember, there were border states like Missouri and Kentucky that owned slaves that were part of the Union, right? So the Emancipation Proclamation does not touch their slaves. It only ends slavery in states that are Confederate that do not rejoin. So it's kind of a bluff or threat to say, like, hey, if you don't rejoin, if you lose, you're going to lose your slaves. But if you quit this and rejoin now, you get to keep them. No slave state takes this offer and rejoins the Union. And so it goes into effect, and the stakes are now higher for the South, right? They know that if they lose, they will lose slavery, and that becomes even scarier for some of them, right? It's also at this time that he begins to accept African American troops into the military, but it's not equality, right? So almost 200,000 volunteer soldiers sign up. They're still heavily discriminated against. So there are people in the military who don't want to fight alongside these blacks. They're given the worst jobs. In some cases, like manual labor jobs. In some cases, they're given the more dangerous or risky positions in battlefields, things like that. They're treated as more expendable. But despite all that, there's still a huge number of these volunteer soldiers who want to go and be a part of freeing slaves that might even be, friends and family of theirs, right? Because remember, some of these people are some of these volunteer soldiers are people who used to be slaves that either freed themselves legally or escaped, right? And so there's a lot of sort of unity in that, this idea of helping out. We talked about before, women get involved with this, but it's not just women in the military. They begin to take over jobs that men would do while they're away at war. And you're going to see the same thing happen in World War I and World War II. This idea of industry still needs to happen. Right? If a bunch of men go and volunteer to go fight, someone has to run the ammunition factories to make bullets. Someone has to keep industry going. And so the women step up and take over these jobs. And it's one of these ways that over time throughout history, women get closer to equal rights, right? Demonstrating that, look, we're just as capable of doing jobs that, are considered men's work before. And then, of course, we're going to see some of that volunteer as nurses in field hospitals and nurses in local city hospitals as well. So, and remember we talked about sort of the gruesomeness of being a medical practitioner on the front lines. A lot of amputation and stuff you can imagine. Some of these nurses saw some real, gruesome stuff. One of the things that's kind of interesting to this too is not everyone is in support of these things, right? In the South, you've got people who are kind of against this war, even though they're living in the Confederate States, and they become known as these states' rights groups. And they look at the Confederacy, which we talked about as it's not really a united country. It's a group of states agreeing to work together. And a lot of these states' rights groups say, hey, we shouldn't have to pay taxes towards the Confederate government or coordinate our military with Jefferson Davis's plans because each state's independent. And so if it's an issue that's not affecting Georgia specifically, we in Georgia shouldn't have to give our money up. And that becomes a huge problem for the Confederate government because they can't make them do it, right? It's an agreed government. They're doing it voluntarily. And so these states' rights groups cause a lot of trouble for Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government, and that they only care about their own state. And it's a very dangerous thing, and it's one of the reasons why the Confederacy had some weaknesses, right? In the North, there are groups of people that get referred to as Copperheads. These are Northern Democrats who did not support Lincoln or his party, and they want peace. They don't want to fight this war. They don't care if slavery exists or not. It doesn't matter to them. And they're very outspoken against Lincoln and what his government was doing. And that leads to some, struggles there too, because now if you're, the northern government, you have to compete or, deal with these people who are also against it, right? Pushing against this war in certain ways, in controversial ways, causing trouble. I also talk about how the draft works. So a draft is military service, required military service. Both sides, the North and South, institute a draft as a way to conscript, force people into the military. And it's a weird kind of draft. It's not really a fair draft. And this is going to be critiqued. People are going to say that this draft is causes the war to really be a war of rich people fought by poor people. And that's because if you were in the South and you owned 20 or more slaves, you were exempt from the draft. If your name came up, you didn't have to go because you were a rich person. The idea was if you owned 20 or more slaves, you are an important part of the Southern economy. They cannot afford to have you go fight. Again, if they have 20-something slaves, they're not actually doing the work. The slaves are doing the work, right? But these are very, very rich, powerful people. Part of the reason that law existed was because, remember, the King Cotton economy, right? The big plantation owners kind of ran politics. They wouldn't elect you or allow you to get elected if you said you're going to draft rich people in the South. They just would fund your opponent, right? It was one of the ways they kept power. North had a similar thing. If you got drafted in the North and you were rich enough, you could pay someone to take your place. Now, this is only the rich could really afford this, but you could go find someone off the street and be like, hey, I'll give you like $4,000 or $5,000 to go and enlist in my spot for this draft. And then you don't have to go. They get your money, plus they get paid for volunteering. It's a good deal for them, right? But people are really critical of this, and they say, this is a war fought by poor people for the rich people. And there are even riots, even as far up as New York City. People take to the streets and protest these draft loopholes and say, this isn't fair. Rich people should be able to buy their way out. If you're going to have a draft, it should be fair to everyone, right? There shouldn't be a way to get out of it. Otherwise, it's not really a system that's equal. And there are other benefits. There are people who still enlisted. Like the picture here is like a propaganda poster to get people to volunteer, right? Saying that you get a bonus, right, if you enlist willingly, versus if you're drafted, you don't get this bounty, right? $100 bounty, a bonus for going in willingly. It's a small thing, right? But $100 back then is not bad. And if you were unemployed or something, that might be reason enough to make you consider, right, enlisting in this. And lastly, the one thing I want to touch on too is the economy real quick. You've got the first income tax passed in the Union, tax on how much you've made that year. Kind of a big deal, something we still have today. It is an interesting idea for a tax. Once you guys get older, get yourself some real jobs, you might have some opinions on that. Never feels good to pay taxes, I don't know what to tell you. Both sides are going to print a lot of paper money in mass, and it causes a rapid inflation, right? It's going to lose value. The South will print more, and their money will lose more value than the North because of this, because their economy is hurting so badly. But it causes some instability economically. It makes it harder for them to trade abroad. So keep in mind that might be something that plays out towards the end of the war. We'll stop there. Make sure that you've corrected your test. If you haven't, get everything turned in. Emancipation PDF activity is due on Friday. Get that in. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Peace out, dog.